So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rabbi Ruti Regan. I'm a feminist rabbi specializing in Jewish ritual and Jewish disability issues. And in the past, I worked with Matan as the rabbinic disability scholar in residence. Now I'm with the Harvard Law School project on disability doing some ritual research. And I have a few other projects in the work, including Parsha Chat and ongoing Twitter Parsha discussion Torah learning group. And I think that this past year and a bit more than a year now has presented some very specific challenges, both in an ongoing way and in terms of how we celebrate holidays. And so, and I think that both Jewish tradition in general and disability tradition in particular have some insights that could help us approach this year, and a year where I think it's particularly important to do it and particularly difficult to do it well on a number of levels. And since Shavuot is upcoming, we'll discuss it in the context of Shavuot today, but I think a lot of this applies more broadly as well. So it's about to be Shavuot. Which is not necessarily one of the easier holidays for us to hold in general, and again, poses some particular challenges this year. So the core theme of Shavuot, as it's practiced now, is we celebrate receiving and accepting the Torah, and we have, we might have an all-night Torah learning party, we might eat cheesecake, we might do any number of other things. In the morning, we read Ruth. But it's a core theme is celebrating acceptance and receiving of the Torah. Again, which in some ways, I think the tone of celebration can fall a little flat in times when so many people are dying. There's so much violence. Our democracy is still very fragile. The pandemic is still raging, people are still dying. And even with an end in sight, even once the pandemic is over, which it's seeming like it will be someday, we're not going to be the same. And the future is still very uncertain. And change is difficult, even when the change is good, of returning to be able to do more things in person, to not having to live this pandemic life. But we also can't have everything consumed with doom and being upset, because we're still people. We still have the need for celebration. We still have the need for like love, sanctity, celebration, and all of those parts of who we are still real. But talking about that can sometimes feel like it falls a little flat. Again, especially when things are really hard, and especially when we're only singing high notes. So I want to talk some about understanding trauma, which I think in both the short and the long term is going to be really important for the functioning and spiritual strength of our communities. So trauma changes us, sometimes in short-term ways, sometimes permanently. Sometimes we're permanently different than we would have been absent the trauma. And sometimes that's disabling. And disability is not as scary as it sounds, even when it comes from injustice. Because when we sustain permanent injury of any type, whether physical or psychological, and I think for a lot of us, it's both, and a lot of us have one or the other, or both right now, either from the pandemic or from pre-existing causes, or from other things that have happened. So trauma changes us. Some of the changes are permanent. Some of the changes can be disabling. And we're still ourselves. We're still like fully human people with full human capacities. We can still do things. The ways we do some of them might be different, just as being disabled in other ways can make the ways we need to do things different. But we can still do things. And the things we can do are still real. We can still learn. And the way we learn and teach is still real, and it's still valuable. And we can still love, we can still be in community, we can still do right by one another. And I think this is worth emphasizing because in the popular narratives about trauma, trauma is often really highly stigmatized. There's often pressure to see it as something that needs to be overcome or needs to be totally healed. And sometimes getting past stuff is possible, sometimes healing is possible, some aspects of it can be mitigated, but the experience changes us, and sometimes the changes are disabling. And sometimes what we need to do is talk about how to honor and accommodate that, and talk about how to support the humanity of people who have either short-term or long-term physical or psychological injuries from something traumatic. So sometimes we get hurt, sometimes the hurt is permanent, and we're still people, and we can still learn, love, do right by one another, do things. And again, that's countercultural, and I know I'm repeating myself a lot, but since it's counterculture, I think it bears repeating. And so we have choices to make about how we're going to approach this. And I think that it's really important to cultivate an intentional practice of choosing love, acceptance, and respect for our community and for ourselves, including people who are different in disabling ways than they were before, or people who are still disabled in the ways that they were before. We can choose to reject stigma. We can choose to accept just the reality of both individual and collective trauma, both the pre-existing kind and the new kind, because we're changing, our community's changing. That's going to be hard. It's been hard, it's going to stay hard, but we're still Jewish community. We're still Jews, we're still operating within Jewish tradition. We haven't broken that, we haven't breached it, we're just dealing with it under the circumstances of who we are and what we're facing. And the Torah is still ours, Jewishness is still ours, and we can still do this even though some things about it are different. And I think that there are things we need to be afraid of, but there are also things we don't need to be afraid of, and things we can be confident in. And I think one thing we can be confident in is that the Jewish tradition has adapted to a lot of traumatic changes, a lot of non-traumatic changes too. But even though we don't see how it's going to adapt necessarily, even though change is scary and it can feel very uncertain when we haven't seen the adaptation yet, we know from centuries of experience that Jews and Jewishness are very resilient. And even when there's a need for dramatic change, we're still Jewish. We still have Judaism, Jewish tradition in the form that it needs to take in the context we're living through. Another way to put it is we have this concept of she is a tree of life to all who holds fast to her. If you want to be literal about it, the Torah is a tree of life to all who hold fast to her. And I think that there are ways in which saying that can fall flat. And there are ways that if we will it, if we really commit to making it true and seeking out the ways it's true and being as honest about it as possible, we can make it true, and we can build a practice of Torah in our communities in which it's true and in which it's reciprocal, because we hold fast to it, it holds fast to us, and we find ways of doing it that are tenable, that are possible, and that are constructive in the circumstances that are before us, whatever they may be. And so this is another way where I say, this is really hard, but I think in a lot of ways it helps to be Jewish, because our tradition has dealt with trauma a lot. That we have like very long-standing generational trauma. We've acquired new collective trauma frequently, and we have a lot of individual trauma about being Jews, especially those of us who are additional things as well. For instance, Jewish women have our own individual and collective experiences, or Jews who are, whatever other intersectional experience. But we have a lot of experience thinking about trauma, holding trauma, and not running away from acknowledging the reality, because it's true whether we face reality or not. And if we work like with our brains and bodies as they are rather than against them, we can do some really great things, even if there's no way back. So Torah knows about trauma. Torah and response to trauma are deeply interwoven with our tradition, even just going back to the biblical narrative itself. There's a lot of trauma, response to trauma in the Exodus from Egypt, in trying to make things work in the desert, in things not working out as expected. And even within the Torah itself, there's a lot of adaptation and change that holds this whole range of experiences. So we've done it before, we can keep doing it. We are as capable of doing it as prior generations and people in other places. It's hard, it's also very much part of our tradition, and it's a continuity, not a breach. We can't go back, we can go forward. And we know part of what that's looking like because we've been doing a lot of building. There's a lot we can't predict, but what we can predict is that there's a way forward. It's on us to build it. We've done it before, we can do it again. And another way in which I think our tradition and liturgy really deeply incorporate holding trauma as something that's real and present, and us as people who are real and present as traumatized people who are people and can do people things. Every single holiday and Shabbat frames itself as a time to remember the Exodus from Egypt. So if you think about it, is the trauma of being in captivity, being violently exploited, and leaving in a way that involved violence, both experiencing violence, witnessing violence, and then living in a still dangerous circumstance in the desert. So even in our founding mythos, which we make sure to remember regularly, there's traumatic events that certainly had an upside, and that certainly we found ways to incorporate and grow from, but also they're traumatic, and it's a trauma that we remember and incorporate into our spirituality without pressure to get over it. And I think that if we have the courage to acknowledge the ongoing nature of certain types of trauma, and that we can hold it even when it doesn't go away, and we can incorporate it and learn from it even when it doesn't go away, it's all over our liturgy. We can do it in new ways, just like we do other things in new ways. So I think that we can do it in new ways. We have to do it in new ways. And we don't have to reinvent the wheel because we've got a lot of pieces to work with. So one thing that I would encourage everyone to do, both personally and in your leadership or teaching role, is think about finding the liturgy and text that can speak to you in your community, because not everything's going to resonate, but we can find things that will. And I'm going to go through a couple of examples of things that speak to me in the times we're living through, and ways I think that they could potentially speak to the various communities we're in. But before we shift to that, since I've said a lot of things in the abstract, before we shift to text, I just want to stop for a minute and see if anyone has questions, comments, things you'd like clarification on, or things you'd like to add. I'm going to stop for a few minutes, and you can either put those in the chat or in the Q&A if you prefer to keep it private. And I'm going to pause for a couple of minutes and stop talking to give people some space to think. going to go ahead and continue, but if you have questions or comments, please put them in the chat. If you'd like to keep them anonymous, you can send them to me directly. But again, I would very much welcome questions and feedback. But let's go on now and look at some text. And I will leave some space for verbal and video questions and answers at the end, because I know some people prefer to ask questions and interact that way. So one thing we read on Shavuot is the book of Ruth. And this resonates for a lot of different ways and different years. But I want to just start with the beginning of the context, because I think the beginning of the context involves a plague and a famine and a lot of individual and collective trauma happening for key figures in the story. And so just to set this up before I read the text, what's happened is that Naomi's two daughters-in-law come down with her, married her sons. Her sons have both died, and now she's going home, and her daughters-in-law want to come back with her, and she's urging them not to because she thinks they'll be better off staying. So just to start here, but Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Turn back, each of you, to her mother's house. May God deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me." Just like, okay, I understand you're attached to me. I understand that you're attached to my sons who you are married to, but I don't want you to get hurt following me home. I want you to stay here where I think you can have a future. And, she says, "May God grant that each of you find security in the house of the husband." She kissed them farewell. They broke into weeping and said to her, "No, we will return to you with your people." Because even though Naomi thinks that they would be safer and better off staying where they are, even if she's right, they don't want to do it. They don't want to break the relationship. And it's always complicated what kind of situations, like how different people respond, right? So they were both thinking they wanted to stay. And then Naomi replied, turn back, my daughters. Why should you go with me? Have I any more sons in my body who might be husbands for you? Turn back, my daughters, for I am too old to be married. Even if I thought there was hope for me, even if I were married tonight and I also bore sons, should you wait for them to grow up? Should you on your account debar yourselves from marriage? Oh no, my daughters, my lot is far more bitter than yours, for the hand of God has struck out against me. They broke into weeping again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law farewell, but Ruth clung to her. So I have again this situation where Naomi wants to go home, and she just thinks that there's really not much hope of her life getting better given the position, given her age and her childlessness and the position of women in the society she was living in. Like, let's assume Naomi was correct in her assessment and knew what she was talking about. Her daughters-in-law, who she saw as her own, who she wanted the best for, and who she really wanted to make sure knew the circumstances they were in, took it into account, and were not endangering themselves on her account when it wouldn't help her or them. Nevertheless, they were two different people. They had different responses to that. And that's kind of how trauma works, and it's kind of how risk works and living in uncertain times works, is that different people are going to respond different ways. And we need to respect that, and we need to respect the range of different, I'm not talking about endangering people, because I don't think, and I see we have a question in the class, in the chat of, in the current divided political climate, do we need to include those who are not vaccinated for COVID, and how do we do that safely? And I know this is easy for me to say from where I sit, but I also think that we do need to take a hard line on this. There's established precedent. I'm a conservative rabbi, so I'll speak for the conservative movement. The conservative movement has a very long-standing consensus position that if vaccination is required to prevent the spread of deadly diseases, we all have the obligation to be vaccinated. And the question this came up in is there were some families in a Schechter school, in a conservative day school, who wanted to enroll their kids, but also wanted them to be unvaccinated and ask for a religious exemption. And now the question was, what do we do with that? And the very clear and unequivocal answer was, we don't permit that. Vaccination is a mitzvah. Vaccination, we're not permitted to endanger each other. And we need to take a hard line on requiring vaccination, not allowing people that endanger, and certainly, like, all the more so, not allowing a religious exemption in a way that would contradict our religious obligations. And I think that we're living in a time where the reality is that choosing to be unvaccinated is choosing to endanger other people. And I don't think that we ought to be doing that. Now, it's a bit more complicated with people who are too young to be vaccinated. And I'm not going to take a position on whether religious schools should be open in areas in which the vaccination rates of adults are high and the local rules permit the opening of in-person religious schools. I think that this is an area where I would say don't take public health advice from rabbis. This is an area where I would say is consult with local public health experts in your community and listen to them about whether it's safe for religious schools to be
mother.
Okay, someone's not muted who should be. Okay. So what I would say is, like, in terms of whether we're in person with children for whom the vaccine is not available, I would say, like, get advice from experts who know the facts on the ground in the area you're operating in and listen to what they tell you. And once the vaccine's available, I think the clear thing is that we do have to make people get vaccinated. I just think there's no way around that. So I just wanted to say that because I think that what I'm saying about personal choices could be misleading given the connotations that personal choice has in communities that are resistant to vaccination. And so I want to be clear, that's not what I mean. What I'm talking about is things that are comparable to, do you personally, if you're Ruth's daughters-in-law, do you go back with her or do you stay? And those are both legitimate choices. And they both had their reasons, neither of them were wrong. And I think that the way we deal with trauma and the way we deal with danger, there's a range of things that we have a right to do. And I think that it's very important for all of us to remember that there's a range of things that we have the right to do. And within that, people are going to have different feelings, make different choices, and have different sensibilities about what's the constructive way forward for them. And we need to be able to hold that and have space for just understanding that different people are different in those ways. And Naomi did that. She urged them to not go back with her on her account, and to, not feel like they had to, and to stay there and to have good lives. But once Ruth was insistent, no, I really do want to go back with you, Naomi respected that, even when she still thought that Ruth was doing something pretty inadvisable. So again, Ruth still wanted to come back. And Naomi pushed her again. See, your sister-in-law has returned to her people and her gods. Go follow your sister-in-law. Then Ruth replied, essentially, like, no, respect this. I'm making a decision. I know what I'm doing. And I really mean it. Nothing you say is going to dissuade me. But Ruth replied, do not urge me to leave you, to turn back and not follow you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus and more may God do to me, if anything but death parts me from you. And I think that in the times we're living through, both in terms of COVID and in terms of other things, people all have responsibilities towards safety, but also there are people who take on obligations to prioritize things other than their own safety. And that might be distressing to watch, but it needs to be done, and we need to respect the fact that people are doing that. Working in healthcare settings is dangerous. Volunteering in vaccination sites has certain risks. Doing a lot of other things has certain risks that we need people to take. And working to save democracy has risks. Working on in-person voter registration has risks. Going to protest racist police violence has risks. And even though it can be hard to watch people commit to taking certain risks, both for a cause and for their own personal sensibilities about where their values lay, we need to accept that that's part of how the world works and not try to make everyone into us and not try to make everyone approach things in the same way. So again, eventually Naomi saw that Ruth meant it and she accepted it. When Naomi saw how determined she was to go with her, she ceased to argue with her, and the two went on until they reached Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole city buzzed with excitement over them. The woman said, "Can this be Naomi?" Naomi said, "Do not call me Naomi," which it's a pun here because the root has a connotation of like pleasantness. "Do not call me Naomi," she replied. "Call me Mara, for Shaddai has made my lot very bitter. I went away full and God has brought me back empty. How can you call me Naomi when God has dealt harshly with me, when Shaddai has brought misfortune among me?" So Naomi goes home and she's feeling this real horrible despair and this real awareness of the dire circumstances she's in. And she even says this to people who like might want to gloss over it. She says, like, no, this is my reality. This is, something that needs to be said. And it was important to her also to make sure that her daughters-in-law were not glossing over it, did not have a starry-eyed view, and that they really were able to acknowledge reality. And I think that one of the most important things that we can do in finding ways to hold trauma going forward is not gloss over stuff, acknowledge the full range of feelings people have, and acknowledging that it's not all sunshine and roses. Some of it's trauma, grief, fear. Some of people's perceptions of danger is accurate, and we're still people. We can still love. We can still do right by each other. We can still do things. We're still Jews. We're still who we are. We can still go forward. And it's a both and, not a one or. And so what happened next? Naomi said, "How can you call me Naomi? Call me Mara, because here are all of the horribly traumatic things I've been through, and here's the danger I'm still in." And then what does the next verse say? The next verse says, "Thus Naomi returned from the country of Moab. She returned with her daughter-in-law, Ruth the Moabite. They arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest." So this verse contextualizes it further, and it says that even through her despair and her like outcry of her really cry of anguish and despair and like loss of identity that Naomi experienced, the text is still recognizing her as Naomi. It's recognizing her as she is still who she is. So I read this as like it was not that she wanted a new name. It was that she was expressing despair, because if people say they want a new name, we have to respect that. But I think that this is an outcry of despair and a play on words. And it was not this is not who I am, but how could I possibly still be? And then the verse says, no, she still is. This is still Naomi. She's still who she is. This is what she did. And not only is there this trauma, grief, and danger, but also they arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest, because the matter of fact things about the world, like that we still harvest grain, raise children, do work, pick fights with each other, whatever else, all of that is still there and still real when something's broken and we're hurt and in danger. And I think that this verse like is very comforting in that sense, because it's not saying no, you're not. It's just saying, yes, you are, this too. And I think the more we can take a matter of fact reaction and say like, yes, all of that's real, and you're still you, the community is still here, and we're working to hold it, deal with it, find ways forward. And so Ruth, Ruth is one example. And Daniela, do we have the capacity to turn it on so people can raise hands if they'd like to weigh in on video?
It's on the reaction button. If you want to raise your hand in your square.
So I'd like to, because I get the sense that for some people being on video is more comfortable than being in the chat. And so I'd like to create both options. Just, okay.
Yeah, so in the reaction button, you can raise your hand.
Daniela, if you could just send me a message when someone has their hand raised.
Sure.
Okay, great. So that's one of my examples is Ruth. I think that Ruth is a story about trauma and disaster and different legitimate responses to disaster, and going forward, even when there's not necessarily a sense of hope, even when there's not necessarily a sense of like emotional optimism, there's still a barley harvest, there's still things going on in the world. And if you keep taking the steps that are available to you, sometimes it eventually leads to things. And we're still here, we're still who we are, and we can hold that. And Ruth can be a reminder to hold that. And so to go through another example of some text that speaks to me, and that I think this is very much your mileage may vary kind of thing, but we recite Hallel on Shavuot and on other holidays as well. And there's a lot of different excerpts I could point out, but want to just look at a couple of them. So I shall walk before God in the lands of the living. I trust in God. There's sort of, I would read this as sort of a poetic hesitancy here. I trust, out of great suffering I spoke and said rashly, all men are false. And this to me just kind of hits really hard, because I think that in the times we're living through, where a lot of people are not being responsible, and when we're very aware of a lot of horrifying behavior, both in terms of violence, in terms of COVID irresponsibility, in terms of racism, in terms of insurrection against democracy, in terms of complicity, in terms of all of that, I feel like most of us have probably said at some point, like, okay, everyone's terrible. I want to give up. I can't do this anymore. Everyone's terrible. Sometimes, specifically all men are terrible, or, all whichever group are terrible. And I think that this really holds well. Sometimes we're going to feel that way. Sometimes we're going to feel that way. And that's like a natural response to certain circumstances. And it's also not true. Like when we value something, there are other people in the world valuing it. When we're trying to work on something, there are other people in the world trying to work on it. And it can be, I think, especially hard to feel that when we're this physically distanced, but we're all still here. And there's a lot of good in the world, and there's a lot of people who are there with us caring about the same things. And sometimes it's hard to feel that, and sometimes it's hard to see that. And I think like that being named as a feeling that people have and being named as something that God doesn't fall into, for me, that's really powerful. And again, this is a your mileage may vary thing, but just we walk before God in the land of the living, even though sometimes we feel in despair, this inaccurate worldview where we just don't feel any ability to trust other people to care about the right things. There still is something sacred. Other people are connected to it too, and God's not giving up on us. That's what it means to me. And yeah, if that speaks to you, great. If it doesn't, then there are a lot of other things in the liturgy, and these are all just intended as examples. And these are very personal and community specific. So if some of these speak to you, great. If they don't, I would encourage you to look through the liturgy and ritual available to you in the text that's read in your community and just think about what speaks to me. How can this be part of how I understand trauma and danger right now? So another part of Hallel, and this is a part that's sung to various tunes in various communities. So Pituli Tsares Sadak Avobam Odeya Sehashala Adonai Tzadikim Yavo. So I think that's one really common tune that's sung to in recitations of Hallel. There are others. But one way to translate this is open the gates of righteousness for me, that I may enter them and praise God. This is the gateway to God. The righteousness shall enter through it. In the Hebrew, it's a little more ambiguous. It's like it, because that word can mean righteousness. It can also mean victorious. So it can mean, so we can read it as both God help me to be righteous and God help me to make my righteous commitments actionable. God help me to make sure that righteousness and justice prevail, not just that they're valued, but that justice wins. And I think that in both of its connotations means a lot to me right now, because I think that in traumatic times, especially when trauma is caused by the combination of natural disasters and injustice and oppression, it's important to shore up our commitment to justice. And again, through my theological worldview, through asking God to help us commit to justice, but also to maintain faith in that, like that it's possible for justice to prevail, and that our efforts are not in vain, and that, you know, all men are false is ultimately a misleading sentiment, because there's a gateway of righteousness and of the victory of justice that we can enter through in all kinds of ways, even though it's hard, even though we might not all see all of it in our lifetime, as the psalmist certainly did not. But it's there, and I think that just knowing that that's part of our tradition, at least for me personally, is helpful right now. So and then there's another part of Hallel that I think can be very meaningful, and that again is often recited out loud in a number of communities. Often twice. Odecha ki anitani va'eti lishua. Odecha ki anitani va'eti lishua. Even masu habonim haita la rosh pina. Even masu habonim haita la rosh pina. Okay. So this is a section again that really jumps out to me often, but especially this year, So, I praise you, or give thanks to you, God, for you've answered me and become my deliverance, which I think in a literal sense is a bit difficult in some ways theologically. But the second part, the stone that the builders has rejected has become chief cornerstone. And that is something God sees as desirable, is something that I think can be really powerful. And this is something I think a lot about as a disabled person, and as a disabled person who works on disability and inclusion issues, is that there are a lot of people in our community and in our world who experience life as being the stone that the builders reject, as the stone that the builders see as impossible and not something that can be part of our community, or too expensive, or just overlooked or not valued. And I think that them being the stone that's rejected is also an experience that I think a lot of women have, that I think a lot of Jews have in broader culture, that just a lot of us have had for a number of reasons, but it looms really large for disability, that, we may experience being the stone that the builders reject, and we can also build really critically necessary things, and we can value ourselves even when we're, treated as a rejected cornerstone, and we can value others who are being treated that way and bring in the building that is necessary. And I think, like, alongside this, not only is this a principle we believe in, but it's a principle that can be a religious principle, that's something that's invoked in relationship to God and in text that's really intense about wanting God to help us make that true. And so open for us the gates of righteousness, and let us be the stones that build even when we're rejected, and let us not reject other people in that way who should be part of what we're building. Because if we develop a spiritual practice of valuing people who've been rejected, valuing ourselves despite rejection, and continuing to build, we can make the world so much better. And the description of Evan Ma'asu, of the stone that has been rejected, is still there. And that's an experience that leaves marks in the way it shapes who people are and how they understand themselves. Like, being brought into community and valued does not erase the trauma of being devalued. And part of what we need to do in order to build the communities we want that can hold the trauma we're all living through now is to allow people to be present and invited without having to pretend that those things aren't true, without having to pretend that being finally in, or being finally through something makes it as though it didn't happen, because it did happen. And formative experiences matter and need to be something that, when we want to, we can talk about, and that is incorporated into how liturgy and ritual and text is interpreted and understood. All parts of us are Jewish and matter. So again, big part of this is honor your whole self. And sometimes that means work on changing certain things, but whatever we are, whatever we do, we are who we are. And one thing that I'm often asked in various types of talks is, how did you overcome disability? What I say, but my usual answer to that is that I didn't overcome disability because I had better things to do, like go to rabbinical school, become a rabbi, learn and teach Torah. And I just would have wasted a lot of time and effort if I'd put everything into overcoming rather than being, and rather than building. And so I think that holding the awareness that the parts of us that may involve permanent disabling injury, whether physical or psychological, wherever it came from, it can still be part of who we are. and it still can be part of who we are in a way that we value and incorporate to our understanding of the world. And I think that if we don't stigmatize any part of ourselves and we just honor it all as real, then we can find so much better ways of solving problems and, you know, loving, doing right by each other, learning, doing things in ways that work. Another thing I would say that's really important, especially in leadership roles, is that I think that we really need to honor partial presence. And I've always thought this, because the reality is, if we demand that people feel be fully present and bring all parts of themselves to the table with no reservation, that has the effect of excluding people who either can't do that because they're not fully accommodated in ways that make that possible, or who don't feel safe doing that, or have reasons to believe that they can't trust the space, or who would be taking a lot of risks. So I think that we need to honor partial presence, people being there and participating to the extent that they're able to risk at this point, and to the extent that's made possible. Like, let people and yourself be partially present, and recognize that as something that helps us build stronger communities and more inclusivity and valuing the full range of who our people are. And okay, so question, can you give examples of being partially present? So one example I'd say is, like, in meditation, some people aren't going to feel comfortable closing their eyes, and we need to be okay with that. Some people are going to be distracted a lot of the time, because being distracted is what enables them to be there at all. Some people are going to need to walk in and out. If we have like a sharing circle where people talk about stuff, some people are going to need to pass. And some people are not going to want to hold hands, or not going to want to hug, or not going to want to, like, stare into other people's eyes in, you know, a ritual intended to, like, increase intimacy. And like all of that, like, in really concrete terms. But also, some people, it's not necessarily going to be expressed outwardly, but people, like, might have a lot of reservations of, okay, so you say be fully present, bring your whole self, but if I talk about disability, am I still going to be welcome? If I'm a woman and I talk about sexism or anything that specifically affects women, am I still going to be welcome? Or does it all mean a really narrow range of things, right? And so I think honoring, like, people being, like, bringing what they're ready to bring, and, like, not pushing people to bring more than they think that they're in a position to bring safely, because sometimes people think it's not safe or right, and even when they're wrong, like, it's their risk to take. And another way of, like, partial presence is if you say be fully present, and then you do a big paper activity with no plan for how you're going to include people who can't write on paper. It's a mixed message, and you're saying, like, essentially it ends up amounting to, okay, do something impossible. And I think that all of those are things that we should be careful about in how we construct space and what we expect from people in our spaces. Does that answer the question about what I mean by being partially present? Thank you. Okay. Again, anyone else has questions, like, please ask them, because I want to be useful to and supportive of this community. So I'd say, so honor partial presence, don't separate people from the community. And I think that this is a principle, again, that it's worth thinking about a lot, because we talk about inclusion, and I think that's a good framework for some things, but I think we also need to talk about how we avoid separating people from the community as a related but different, somewhat distinct framework. And I think that this is complicated in a number of directions. Like, one one sense of don't separate people from the community is don't make people's presence in community contingent on pretending that trauma doesn't matter, contingent on pretending that they're happy about everything, or contingent on like not pushing for access needs. And also don't separate people from the community. It's like another thing that I think we need to all think about as we return to doing more things in person is that for some people, the pandemic has been a time of much greater connectedness and access to Jewish space than they've ever had before. Like people who live in areas where getting to a synagogue is not possible or not possible regularly, people who are homebound or who already couldn't safely leave without making themselves sick, or for any number of reasons, a lot of people, including a lot of people with disabilities, have more access to Jewish things and Jewish connectedness than they've ever had before. And I personally started doing sessions of my Twitter Torah study group on Shabbat, which I'd never done before the pandemic, because I realized that, if I wanted to tell people don't go to synagogue and I wanted them to listen and don't gather in person, I could not make that mean don't have a community, don't be connected, because people will risk their lives for the sake of not being isolated and for the sake of not being cut off from Jewish things that are important to them. So if I wanted that to be actionable, I had to make it possible. So I started doing my study group on Shabbat, which I would not have done before. But then what I learned is that a lot of my people who we were learning with already needed that, and like already needed a different form of connection. And that's given me a lot to think about in terms of how I approach Shabbat, in terms of how I approach community building, because the people who have had more access to community now are still part of the community in ways that we need to continue to value and hold. And that's going to get complicated. And there's no one way that's going to look, because there are also good reasons not to broadcast everything, because this has created a level of surveillance and like feeling like you're always being recorded and watched by you don't know who, that also has problems. So there's no simple solution to this, but it's something that I think we need to keep thinking about and incorporating to our practice of how do we avoid separating people from the community. And another sense of like, what do we mean when we say we? And does it include the full range of people who are part of things? So again, like that don't separate people from the community could be a whole presentation, and maybe someday it will be. That's sort of the short version for now. And I would say like another thing that I think is critically important in the times we're living through is be honest. We're different than we were before. Some problems already existed, but we're adapting. Many things are unpredictable. Some things are hard in new ways. Some things are valuable and good in new ways. We still have a lot of work we need to do in order to adapt and to hold all of these things in long-term ways. And it's hard, but it's more possible when we acknowledge reality. Because reality is still there, whether we acknowledge it or not. And we can do so much more when we work with it rather than against it. Or another way I can put it is, when you give up false hope, you can have the real kind. And I think that getting real is generally advisable when we want to build stronger, more loving, more humanizing communities. Say also just persist. Easier said than done, but we've got a lot of things that are hard, and we've got a lot of people who are good, and we've got a lot of great things to work with. And sometimes we can keep going out of a sense of optimism or hope, or even partial hope or grittiness. But even when we can't feel that, and sometimes we can't, we shouldn't try to order ourselves to feel that, because we can keep going even in moments where we can't feel that. Like sometimes it's not like I'm going to keep going because I have hope that things will get better. Sometimes it's I'm going to keep going, because I have a lesson plan that I need to plan, or because I have a meeting, or because my dog's barking, or because, you know, there's this one little thing. Like, it doesn't have to be this persistence doesn't have to look like constant awareness of like this great existential hope. Sometimes it can be these little things, and it doesn't have to be huge or transformative. We just need to keep going and keep adapting, because we've got so much to work with, and we can do this whether or not we can feel it in a particular moment. And so, and I think each and every one of these things could have been a whole talk, but that's, you know, some texts that I think are valuable and some principles I think that it's useful for us to approach things with. And now we've got a couple minutes left. So would anyone like to ask more questions, either in the chat or on video?